Beautiful. Thank you, choir and congregation. Happy New Year, Fourth Universalist Society in the city of New York. What an honor it is to have been invited to lead this first worship service of this epic 2020 New Year. Thank you, Reverend Mark Catolo and Interweave, for inviting my partner Robert and I to worship with you. I am the Reverend Michael Crumpler, the LGBTQ and Multicultural Programs Director at the Unitarian Universalist Association. I bring you greetings from the Unitarian Universalist Association in Boston and our UUA President, the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, on this welcoming worship Sunday. In this 2020 New Year, extreme times call for extreme welcome. Today's readings span 56 years. Just as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. shook the foundation of ecclesiastical society in the Atlantic in August of 1963 with the penning of his letter from Birmingham jail, Presbyterian minister Mark Galli broke the internet when he published "Trump Should Be Removed from Office" in Christianity Today on December 19th, 2019. Beyond the social critique that each of these epic essays offer American life in their respective seasons, they are a prophetic warning for the Christian church, if not the entire swath of faith and religious community, in that their intended recipients are not the secular public, but people of faith. And not people of faith in general, but their clerical peers. Those who have been uniquely called by God and entrusted with the sacred responsibility of being the face of the divine in service to humanity, while also standing on behalf of humanity before the face of the divine. Like Amos and Paul and Martin Luther and John Bunyan, Mark Galli and Martin Luther King serve as our modern-day prophets, warning the faithful of the implications of religious contradictions. Contradictions that extend beyond any doctrinal or theological differences. The ecclesial contradictions unveiled in Jim Crow's America of 1963 and the America Being Made Great Again of 2019. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King warned his 8 well-meaning white contemporaries, clergy, who challenged his method of direct nonviolent resistance that oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The urge for freedom will eventually come. This is what has happened to the American Negro. Something within has reminded him of his birthright of freedom. Something without has reminded him that he can gain it. Likewise, the Reverend Mark Galli warned his evangelical peers, if we don't reverse course now, will anyone take anything we say about justice and righteousness with any seriousness for decades to come? And to our Unitarian Universalist ministers and religious educators, my warning in this 2020 New Year is that extreme times call for extreme welcome, because our queer and trans siblings cannot remain marginalized forever. If we do not reverse course now, will anyone take anything we say about justice and righteousness with any seriousness in the decades to come? And not only queer and trans, but our Black and brown siblings cannot remain marginalized forever. If we do not reverse course now in this 2020 New Year, will anyone take anything we say about justice and righteousness with any seriousness for decades to come? And not only our Black and brown siblings, but our undocumented siblings cannot remain marginalized forever If we do not reverse course now, in this 2020 new year, will anyone take anything we say about justice and righteousness with any seriousness for decades to come? And not only our undocumented siblings, but our climate cannot remain marginalized forever. If we do not reverse course now in this 2020 new year, will anyone take anything we say about justice and righteousness with any seriousness for decades to come? And not only our climate, but those in the wake of war and terror in the Middle East cannot remain marginalized forever. If we do not reverse course now, in this 2020 new year, will anyone take anything we say about justice and righteousness with any seriousness for decades to come? At this moment in the sermon, let me alleviate any anxiety by letting you know that this is not a sermon about Trump. Well, actually, it's an editorial note to myself as I was writing the sermon not to preach a sermon about Trump, although I would love to preach that sermon. Nor is it a sermon to the religious moderates or even the evangelical faithful, although I would love to preach that sermon. But rather, this is a sermon to my fellow religious professionals of Unitarian Universalism. In 2019, there were at least 24 transgender persons murdered in the United States, most of whom were Black trans women, two more died while under police custody, one at Rikers and the other at a hospital in El Paso, shortly after being released from ICE custody. Extreme times call for extreme welcome. On May 19th, 2019, the Equality Act passed the House, but has since been stalled in the Senate. This is federal legislation that would provide consistent and explicit discrimination protections for LGBTQ plus persons across key areas of life, including employment, housing, credit, education, public spaces and services, federally funded programs, and jury service. Extreme times call for extreme welcome. On October 8th, 2019, the U.S. Supreme Court heard oral arguments on whether to take away existing employment protections for LGBTQ plus Americans fired for being gay and transgender. Extreme times call for extreme welcome. On November 1st, 2019, the Department of Health and Human Services announced that it's considering a rule that would allow federally funded programs to turn away those in need because of their sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or religion. Extreme times call for extreme welcome because oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. If we do not reverse course now, will anyone take anything we have to say about justice and righteousness with any seriousness in 2020 or in the decades to come? Yes, extreme times call for extreme welcome. The 8 white religious leaders addressed in King's letter from a Birmingham jail were not members of the KKK or rabid segregationists, but rather they were well-meaning white Christian ministers arguing for patient negotiations rather than direct actions, sit-ins, and marches. Having recently elected a less hostile segregationist administration, these well-meaning white Christian ministers begged King, why didn't you give the new administration time to act? King's response was, history is the long and tragic story of the fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. The evangelical leaders incensed by Mark Galley were probably not among those in Charlottesville, Virginia, who, with tiki torches in hand, dressed in khakis and polos, chanted, "Jews will not replace us," or at least I hope not. Nor should we suspect them of exhibiting violence against women or even hostility against immigrants. As a former evangelical myself, I can personally attest that many of the ministers I know are the most well-meaning, law-abiding, generous, and forgiving people I've ever met. It is to this very charity that Reverend Galley appeals to when he says, "If we do not reverse course now, will anyone take anything we say about justice and righteousness with any seriousness from decades to come? Can we say with straight face that abortion is a great evil that cannot be tolerated, and with the same straight face say that the bent and broken character of our nation's leader doesn't really matter in the end?" Both of these esteemed latter-day prophets are stirring their peers to move beyond complacency and toward a sense of urgency. But why am I preaching this sermon in a Unitarian Universalist congregation or a Universalist congregation? For decades, we have been a welcoming faith. For over a century, we have been a faith of abolition. For decades, we have been a suffrage faith, a subversive faith, ever ready to disrupt the wheels of empire, ever ready to trample the viability of the marginalized in pursuit of wealth and power. This sermon is relevant for precisely that reason, because empire is ever ready and eager to trample the viability of the marginalized in pursuit of wealth and power. Despite our Unitarian Universalist goal of a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, as stated in our sixth principle. A century after the advocacy of Francis Perkins, women are still fighting for equality, as evidenced by the Me Too movement. A half century after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, in 2013, the Supreme Court has effectually gutted two provisions that would have prevented voter disenfranchisement. Since then, 1,000 polling sites have been closed, many of which are located in predominantly black counties in the South. And 50 years after the Stonewall Uprising, despite the passing of marriage equality, queer and trans employees are still being fired, evicted, defunded, and denied the privilege of adoption just for being queer and trans. So yes, extreme times call for extreme welcome, even in a Unitarian Universalist faith where women of color are still being passed over for ministry opportunities. Ministers of color are still suffering higher than average instances of negotiated resignations from settled ministries, and 3 in 4 trans Unitarian Universalists report not feeling as though their congregation is completely inclusive of them as trans people. Of our more than 1,100 Unitarian Universalist congregations, only 112 have pledged to support the new sanctuary movement or are offering sanctuary. Even as migrant children are being locked in cages at the border, and even as the world's top climate scientists have warned that emissions of carbon dioxide would have to be cut by 45% by 2030, just 30% of our Unitarian Universalist congregations are fully accredited green sanctuaries. If extreme action for King was direct action, sit-ins, and marches, and for Mark Galley was impeachment, what is extreme action for our beloved Unitarian Universalist faith? Where, as LGBTQ and multicultural programs director, I am constantly asked the question, is welcome renewal necessary? Must we use the term white supremacy? Is the use of the pronoun they proper English? To all of which the answer is a resounding yes. Yes, because we are living in extreme times, and history is the long and tragic story of the fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Privilege is still very much dominant in our congregations. As a highly educated, predominantly white, middle-class faith, it is the water we all swim in. It doesn't mean we're evil, but simply susceptible to complacency. And the only way to ward off that complacency is through direct action. Lest measured success in the fighting for civil rights, climate justice, women's rights, immigrants' rights, LGBTQ rights, and the dignity of the poor lead us to a false conclusion that our work is done. As such, we must always be renewing our welcome to queer and trans persons, campaigning for the poor, resisting climate change, dismantling white supremacy, accompanying Black and brown immigrants and asylum seekers until the Equality Act is passed in both the House and the Senate, until we achieve zero Black and trans murders to mourn on Transgender Day of Remembrance, until every child has food to eat and a roof over their head, until every county has enough polling places for every Black and brown vote to be cast and counted, until DACA becomes law, and until the emissions of carbon dioxide is completely eliminated. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. For if Unitarian Universalism becomes complacent now, how will anyone take anything we have to say about justice and equity seriously in 2020 or in generations to come? Extreme times call for extreme welcome. Amen. Ashe. May it be so.